right, diving in today, huh? We're tackling something, well, pretty universal, I think. Fear.
Yeah, I mean, who hasn't felt that jolt, right?
Exactly. And, you send over some really interesting research on, like, the psychology behind facing those fears. So our mission today is to break it down. What's the most useful, insightful stuff we can give to, the listener from all this?
Absolutely. We're going to dig into some of those techniques, like the actual psychology behind how you can work with fear, understand it better.
Okay, so first things first, right? I think we got to define this. What is fear? I mean, we all kind of know it when we feel it, but from a psychological perspective, what are we actually talking about here?
Yeah, totally. So, psychologically speaking, we're talking about an emotion. It's triggered by, some kind of perceived threat,
Mm,
right, to our safety, our well-being, even just our comfort.
makes sense.
And and it is normal. It's like a protective mechanism. It's built in. Problem is, it can get a little out of hand.
Right, like not every rustle in the bushes is a tiger, right?
Exactly. It becomes a problem when it's just totally out of proportion to the actual danger, or it sticks around when there's no real threat anymore. Think of, like phobias. Persistent, irrational fears, those can really, really get in the way of, living your life.
So if fear can be so powerful, so disruptive, why even bother facing it?
Right.
Like, it seems almost counterintuitive, right? Wouldn't you just want to avoid the things that scare you?
Well, yeah, I mean, avoidance is the natural instinct, right? But here's the thing, and this is where it gets interesting. The research is really clear on this.
Yeah.
Confronting your fears intentionally, head on, it's actually the key to overcoming them.
Wow.
It's like a muscle, The more you avoid something, the scarier it gets.
Okay, so you keep saying facing your fears, but I think our listeners are probably wondering what that actually looks like. What are we talking about
Yeah,
here?
right. Good point. So it's not just like, jumping into the deep end. It's more about consciously like learning to manage your body's reaction, that fear response.
So how do you do that?
Well, it takes practice. It means allowing yourself to feel that discomfort, the anxiety, and this is the key, until the fear lessens naturally. And it will. And, it takes courage. And understanding your triggers, what sets you off, that's essential.
Okay, this sounds like the nitty-gritty our listeners waiting for. What are the actual tools, the techniques that can help them do this?
You bet. So let's start with maybe the most well-known, exposure therapy.
Okay, break it down for us.
All right, so this involves repeatedly facing the thing you fear, but, and this is super important, in a safe setting, controlled environment. The idea is avoidance isn't actually making you safer. It's facing those fears in a, smart way that teaches your brain, hey, it's okay.
So, like, how does that work? I mean, what's the mechanism there?
Well, there's actually a few things going on. There's habituation. Basically, you get used to it. The more you're exposed to something, the less reactive you become.
Right, like that annoying dripping faucet. Eventually, you just tune it out.
Exactly. And then there's extinction. That's like a learned association fading away. Like, if you were always afraid of dogs because one barked at you as a kid, exposure to friendly dogs can help weaken that link. The negative outcome you expect doesn't happen, so the fear response diminishes.
So it's not just getting used to it. It's also unlearning the fear.
Right on. And then there's what's called emotional processing, which is kind of fancy for, forming more realistic beliefs about the feared situation.
Okay, so your thoughts about it change.
Yeah, and you start to realize, hey, I can actually handle this. That's what we call increased self-efficacy, the belief in your ability to cope. And that's huge.
So what kinds of exposure are we talking about here? What could our listener actually do?
Good question. So, there's in vivo exposure, which means real life, in the flesh.
So facing the actual spider, not just a picture.
Exactly. And then there's imaginal exposure where you vividly picture the fear in your mind. And, with technology now, we have virtual reality exposure, which can be incredibly powerful for simulating things like heights or flying.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see how VR could be really useful for that.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's another one. It's called interoceptive exposure, and this involves intentionally bringing on those feared physical sensations. So, like, if you're afraid of dizziness during a panic attack, you might spin in a chair to show yourself that sensation itself isn't dangerous.
Okay, I get it. So it's about really understanding those sensations and showing yourself you can cope.
You got it. And there are techniques like, graded exposure, where you tackle your fears step by step. You start small, really manageable, and work your way up. And sometimes combining exposure with relaxation techniques can be helpful. And, for specific phobias like a fear of spiders or heights, real life exposure it's really often the most effective.
That makes sense. Okay, so that's exposure therapy. We've also got cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. How does that fit into all of this?
Right, so CBT, it's all about the connection between your thoughts, feelings, and actions. The idea is if you can change those negative thought patterns, the doom and gloom, you can change how you actually react to the fear.
Okay, so your thoughts actually influence how afraid you feel.
Big time. It's like those thoughts create a feedback loop. So in CBT, a key component is what's called cognitive restructuring, basically retraining your inner critic,
Yep.
challenging those automatic negative thoughts that pop up when you're afraid.
So you learn to talk back to those negative thoughts.
Exactly. You learn to question them, to look for evidence, to come up with more balanced, realistic thoughts. And CBT often uses gradual exposure too, along with behavioral experiments. Like, okay, you're afraid of public speaking, so let's test out what actually happens. Maybe start by talking to a small group of friends and see, does the world really end?
So put those fears to the test. See if they hold up. I like it. Now, we also have acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, which sounds pretty different. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, ACT is a little bit of a different approach. It's not about eliminating the fear. It's about, well, accepting it. Accepting those difficult thoughts and feelings without judgment. And here's the key. Committing to actions that are in line with what's truly important to you, your values, even when you're afraid.
So you're not trying to get rid of the fear. You're trying to live a good life alongside it.
You got it. It's about like making room for the fear, the anxiety, but not letting it run the show. Some of the techniques they use in ACT include, mindfulness, which is about paying attention to your thoughts and feelings without judgment, and cognitive diffusion, which is about creating some distance between you and those scary thoughts. Like, oh, there's that thought again, but it's just a thought, not a fact.
Okay, so not getting caught up in those thoughts, recognizing they're not necessarily true.
Exactly. And
Right.
then there's also values clarification, which is really about, figuring out what truly matters to you, what gives your life meaning, and then using those values to guide your actions, even when you're feeling afraid.
That's really powerful. So
Mm.
big picture, all of this, all these different approaches, what are some of the benefits someone might see from actually tackling their fears this way?
Well, there are a ton. Greater confidence, obviously,
Mm.
less anxiety, less avoidance, overall, just a better quality of life.
That's huge.
Oh, for sure. And, you also build resilience, you develop better coping skills. It really empowers you to go after those things that you want, those goals, those dreams.
Okay, but it's not always easy, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the hurdles, some of the challenges that people typically bump up against when they're trying to face their fears?
Yeah, I mean, let's be real. It's tough. There's that natural urge to avoid, right? It's like wired into us. And the anxiety itself, when it gets intense, that can be a huge challenge. And, those negative thought patterns, they can be so deeply rooted, so automatic. And sometimes people just lack the motivation or the support and, setbacks happen. It's not always a linear process.
Right, it's a journey. Okay, so before we wrap up, could you give our listener maybe a couple of quick examples of how these approaches might play out in real life?
Sure thing. So let's say you have presentation anxiety. CBT might involve, challenging those thoughts, like I'm going to freeze up, everyone's going to judge me, and you practice, you rehearse, you gradually expose yourself to speaking situations. Or, social anxiety, you might use gradual exposure, start with small interactions, work your way up to larger groups, and you combine that with CBT to work on those negative thoughts.
Like said.
ACT can be really helpful for things like, panic disorder. Learning to accept those physical sensations without judgment, that can be a game changer. And then basic exposure therapy could involve, someone with a fear of spiders gradually working their way up from looking at pictures to being in the same room as a spider to eventually maybe even holding one.
Wow, that's quite a progression. Okay, so this has all been super helpful, but how does our listener know when it's time to reach out to a professional, versus trying to tackle this stuff on their own?
That's a great question. I'd say if the fear is really dominating your life, it's limiting you, it's keeping you from doing the things you want to do, if you've tried self-help and it's just not cutting it, or, if you're noticing a long-term negative impact on your mental health, your physical health, that's definitely a sign to reach out. And, if you're constantly altering your routine to avoid the fear or you're experiencing really intense distress, panic attacks, that kind of thing, professional help it's definitely recommended.
Okay, so it's about knowing when you need that extra support.
Right. A therapist can provide that guidance, that support, a safe environment for exposure, and, they can really tailor a plan that's specific to your needs and your situation.
That makes sense. So to wrap things up, I think this has been a really insightful look into understanding and really facing fear. We've covered exposure therapy, CBT, ACT, kind of the core ideas behind each, and when it's time to seek support.
Absolutely. And the thing is, there are so many tools out there, and these psychological approaches, they're really powerful. They can really help you create positive change in your life.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as our listeners kind of absorbing all this, thinking about it, I'm curious, what's one takeaway that really resonates with you? Maybe it's that structured approach of exposure, or maybe it's the acceptance focus of ACT that offers a new perspective on, your own challenges with fear. Whatever it is, I think that's worth holding on to.
Yeah, definitely. And, building on that, here's a final thought for our listener to chew on. Considering these psychological tools we've talked about, what's one small step, even just a tiny step, that you could consciously take this week to gently lean into a fear? Not to conquer it, immediately, but just to observe your reaction, to build a little more awareness. I think that's a powerful place to start.
I love that. Just a little nudge in the direction of courage.
Exactly.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
My pleasure. Anytime.